Good morning. As people are joining us, I'm Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt, chairman of the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, and we're very pleased to offer a call today, knowing that are a lot of people offering and organizations offering a lot of calls out there. As all of us try and stay ahead of the curve, try and stay informed of what's happening, and to do the best we can in order to be able to both remain informed, to counter misinformation that's out there, and to be able to help our communities. Just to remind everyone that in many respects, what's going on right now is a multi-front assault on Israel. And I'm not just referring to the fact that it's being attacked both and has a multi-front war vis-a-vis Hamas in the south, the forces coming in from Syria, which they must be careful of, as well as in the north with Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies, but also in the context of the international media and the international public opinion. And so in that context, that's why we're offering what we're offering today, a powerful discussion about the role of international law and understanding Israel's actions from the perspective of international law. Next Tuesday at 11 a.m. We'll be happy to, we're pleased to be offering a second seminar in our series. The second one will be is Tuesday at 11 a.m. when Professor Jeremy Weider, who is with the Yeshiva University, will be speaking about halakhic implications of Israel's response, and in terms of helping to teach us and study with us about what Israel is doing. And then after that, we intend to offer webinars that will deal with, from a practical perspective, will Israel be able to achieve its military goals and also its political goals? And then also a session about how the media is covering the war. In that context, I do want to mention that those who are members of the call, who are rabbis, and this is being recorded, so it'll be shared with other colleagues as well, are encouraged to understand the importance of our being informed, as well as of everyone, of our role helping our college children understand what's going on, of keeping the media responsible, our political officials, and also, of course, our communities. That's part of the purpose of why the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition is sponsoring this call. And finally, in that context, one of the things we're doing is building public support. So those who have not yet had, rabbis who have not yet had a chance to sign our letter for the solidarity and support and unity, please do so. Shortly, it'll be put in the chat. First of all, you just saw the connection to our call to register for the call next week. And then next will be our opportunity. If you haven't yet signed our letter of unity, solidarity, and support for Israel, please do so. To the extent there are any members of communities on this call who might not, check with your rabbi, make sure that they've signed it, and if you know others as well. With that, without any further ado, I'd like to go straight now to our guest for today. His name is Matthew Waxman. I'm so glad that you can be with us today, Matthew. It's so important. And of all people, certainly you bring so much to the table. For those of you who may not know Matthew, you should. He is a nationally known authority, widely recognized for his expertise on issues of national security law, of cybersecurity, terrorism, intelligence, and armed conflict, along with war powers and the regulation of military technology, counterterrorism, surveillance, and cybersecurity. So this is his, as we use the term today, this is his wheelhouse. His articles appear regularly in Lawfare National Security blog. And Matthew also is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, where he serves as an adjunct senior fellow for law and foreign policy. Matthew currently is on the faculty of Columbia University, where he teaches law there. He, in fact, chairs the National Security Law Program there, and has helped create Columbia Law's Judges Advocate Scholars Program, which brings military lawyers to have the opportunity to study. As a National Security Council aide prior to his work, and as a professor of law, he was involved in the White House response to the attacks on September 11 and helped to coordinate the legal compliance then, as well as at other times in his career. I could go on, but let me stop here, having served as a clerk for a Supreme Court justice. Indeed, the gentleman we're about to hear from, Matthew Waxman, professor of law at Columbia University, on the topic of the international legal response and perspective on Israel's response to the disastrous, heinous, sadistic attacks on that Black Shabbat known as on October 7th. Matthew, thank you for joining us. The program is yours.
Thanks very much, Rabbi. And let me also, before I start, just thank you all. Obviously, this has been a horrific time in Israel, and for many of us here, especially those of us who have family, other loved ones in Israel. So I wanted to also to thank everybody on this call for your work with your communities, your congregations. Let me also just say one other thing before getting into the law. I've been asked to speak about international law and especially the laws of war. Before getting into that, let me just say that I study war crimes for a living. And the level of sadistic barbarity that I saw in the October 7th pogrom by Hamas is truly shocking, even by the standards of war crimes. It's truly inhuman and could never, ever be justified, I think, under any legitimate moral code. But Israel is now in a war against a terrorist adversary that doesn't follow any rules. In fact, as I'm sure we'll discuss, Hamas perverts and exploits those legal rules in order to gain some strategic advantage, even at the expense, often especially at the expense of civilians in Gaza. Those observations don't mean that Israel can't, or that we rather can't or shouldn't sympathize with civilian casualties and suffering in Gaza. We can and we should. Nor does it mean that Israel shouldn't comply with international law in its response. It absolutely should, for and I'll argue for legal, for moral, for strategic reasons. But I mention that level of barbarity because I think it's some important context for how international law applies here, for understanding Israel's right of self-defense as well. So I thought I would begin with a general overview of the laws of war and how they apply here to this kind of conflict. The technical term, by the way, for the laws of war is usually either international humanitarian law, or I prefer the term law of armed conflict. This is a body of law that developed, evolved over hundreds of years. And then much of it was in the late 19th century and throughout the 20th century codified in a set of treaties. Many of you have probably heard of, for example, the Geneva Conventions that provide some protections for civilians or those who are captured in war. But the law of armed conflict encompasses not only law that's been reduced to writing in treaties, but also what we international lawyers call customary international law, which means the general and consistent practice of certain rules followed out of a sense of obligation. So what I'm going to be talking about here is really a combination of treaty law and customary law. And if I were to try to boil down the law of armed conflict, a very complex body of law, into just a few minutes, I would do it this way, which I hope captures a lot of what's going on in that body of law. At the most general level, the law of armed conflict seeks to balance two interests. We refer to military necessity, the imperative to wage war effectively, and humanitarian values, reducing human suffering. And those balances are reflected in a pair of core basic principles that I think are especially relevant here in the Gaza war. And I think those two principles really explain much of the entire body of the law of armed conflict. These two principles really pervade a lot of the specific rules. And those two principles are, one, distinction, and two, proportionality. So the principle of distinction means that forces may only deliberately strike military targets, military personnel. You can't target deliberately civilians or civilian property. Now, this is not a rule that no civilians may be killed incidentally. That's a tragic consequence of every war. It has been and will continue to be a horrible consequence of this war on a very large scale. But the principle of distinction requires that civilian property not deliberately be targeted. Now, the principle of distinction, though, contains an important corollary, which is the defender must not deliberately put civilians in harm's way. No use of human shields, no use of mosques, schools, hospitals as bases from which to conduct attacks or store military supplies. And when a force, including a terrorist group, does so, when it uses a civilian site, again, a hospital, a school, an apartment building, as a base for conducting military operations or for military purposes, that site loses its protected status. It can be targeted because the other side has made it into a military target. This, though, brings us to the second principle, proportionality. And I want to spell that out carefully, not only because it's important, but because it is often, I think, misstated, especially in the context of Israeli operations in a war like this. And the rule of proportionality goes like this. The anticipated civilian harm of a military operation cannot be excessive compared to the expected military gain, right? It's a comparison. The anticipated civilian harm of a military operation can't be excessive compared to the expected military gain. Now, many of you, because you deal with these kinds of rules and balances in a lot of your own work, will notice quickly that both sides of that balance are pretty hard to calculate, right? How do you measure military gain? How do you quantify civilian harm? But this is really a rule of based on reasonable judgment. So, for example, you can't bomb, let's say, an entire housing complex, an entire apartment building, because in order to take out one single sniper, right? That would violate the rule of proportionality. And I spell it out carefully here and repeat myself because sometimes this principle of proportionality is misstated. It's misstated as some sort of macabre comparison of body counts, right? Hamas killed this number of people, so Israel can only kill this number of people. That's not that's not how proportionality works in the law of armed conflict. It's a comparison of the expected military gain from an operation versus the anticipated civilian harm. It's a prospective judgment by a commander based on reasonableness. That's the proportionality principle. There are lots of other very specific rules in the law of armed conflict, but I think much of that entire body of law really boils down to applying those two principles: distinction and proportionality. So let me conclude with three general points that I think are going to come up a lot in our conversation, and come up in a lot of the specific controversies that we've already seen in this war. To enumerate a few, allegations that Israel has bombed civilian sites and caused a lot of civilian collateral damage, including a lot of civilian suffering. Some of those allegations turned out to be completely false, like the allegations of bombing a hospital in Gaza. The laying of siege, right? Defense Minister Gallant immediately after the attacks said, we Israel are going to impose a complete siege on Gaza. Nothing's getting in. So a lot of controversy about that. Controversy about the so-called evacuation order, telling Gazans to get out of northern Gaza, move south. I would say that these three things: significant collateral damage, siege, and the movement of people from the north to the south of Gaza have been among the biggest controversies. I'll explain the legal justifications for those things. I think that would be a good way to use some of the Q&A. But in doing so, I emphatically don't want to dismiss the significant human harm, human suffering that comes with them. Because the law of armed conflict is not intended to make war humane. It's intended to make it more humane, but it is not to sanitize war and make it humane. So let me mention three concluding points to sort of set up the rest of the conversation. One is the urban environment always poses special challenges of compliance with the law of armed conflict, right? We're talking here about conducting high-intensity combat operations in one of the most densely populated places in the world. And Hamas and its infrastructure are deeply embedded in that very dense population. They're trying to embed themselves even further in civilian populations, civilian property. So distinguishing between military and civilian targets, keeping down the level of civilian harm will always be difficult, no matter how precisely Israel tries to engage in military operations. It is impossible in an environment like that to avoid significant harm to civilian property. Incidental civilian harm, I would say not deliberate civilian harm, but incidental civilian harm. Second, a lot of these rules, distinction, proportionality, and some other rules we might get into, turn on intent. They turn on judgment by commanders operating amid the fog of war. So when large numbers of civilians in, let's say, an airstrike occur, it may be very difficult to draw a legal conclusion from that fact alone. An airstrike that is conducted in accordance with the law may look to an observer, may look to a reporter exactly the same exactly the same to the naked eye as an airstrike that's conducted in violation of the law. We saw that, for example, we've seen that a number of times with some very snap legal judgments. And so one important point I often emphasize both to audiences like this, but also when I'm briefing reporters, is that it is very dangerous, I think, to draw snap legal judgments before we have all the facts. And the third point I would just conclude with is that the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, are trained to take great care in following these rules. And they're fighting against an adversary, an enemy who flouts those rules for its own gain. One side cares a lot about civilians, the other doesn't, even civilians in Gaza that Hamas claims to be fighting for. That complicates the application and compliance with the law. It does not absolve Israel of its own compliance with the law. And this obviously creates a certain significant asymmetry between the way that Israel must conduct its operations and the way that Hamas does. Again, just to summarize a couple of things, the law of armed conflict is designed to make war more humane, not to make it humane. war will always be brutal and destructive. It will carry immense hardships and tragedy. And I do want to emphasize Israel's legal, moral, and strategic obligation, the importance along all three of those dimensions of compliance with the law of armed conflict. So why don't I end it there, Rabbi, and invite your questions.
Sure. Thank you for such a cogent presentation. It really is extremely helpful. But the first question I have for you, Matthew, is how much of what you've just shared with us so far is subjective, your opinion, and how much of it is objective? In other words, if we had another professor of law, perhaps who studied at the Bir Zayat University, who might and is an expert on international law, would there be a different perspective, or is this pretty much the MS, the true objective perspective?
So let me say I'm a law professor, so I begin a lot of my answers with it's complicated, right? It's one reason why I'm rarely invited back on a TV show, for example, where they're just looking for a soundbite. It's complicated. Many of the rules that I just explained are contested in some ways. I think the basic rules that I laid out, especially an emphasis on distinction and proportionality, that's the consensus view. That's where there is, I think, almost universal agreement that those rules apply. Where there's going to be some difference of opinion, I think, would be on the extent of Israel's right of self-defense. I mean, we see some audiences trying to justify in some way, explicitly or implicitly, Hamas's attacks. And so there may be a difference of a view on that. I think that view is plainly wrong, but we're hearing it a lot. And I would say that where there's the biggest disagreement, and we'll get into this in the Q&A, really has to do with the facts, that if we look at something like the bombing of a particular target and causing collateral damage, different people may reach different judgments about whether or not that was proportionate. When we talk about Israel's warnings to individuals, to people of northern Gaza, warnings and saying, move south because we're about to bomb heavily these otherwise populated areas, there will be, I think, a split of opinion on questions like that of whether or not that complies with international law. So perhaps it might be helpful, as much as possible in the time we have when we go into specific issues, for me to sort of to give you my view, but also where I think it's appropriate to say, here's the argument on the other side.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions in the chat, which I'm going to get to from colleagues in just a moment. One of the questions I have is, when we're talking about the, as you referred to it, the law of armed conflict, who adopted this? I mean, was this adopted by some international body, as countries have signed on to it and so on? Can you share with that? And then again, I'm going to get into some of the questions that have been sent.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Where does international law come from, right? Yeah. And I usually take the view, this is a common view, but it's not the only view, that international law comes from the consent by states around the world. The easiest way to think about that consent is when there are treaties. So all or virtually all countries in the world have signed and ratified the Geneva Conventions I mentioned before. So certain protections for individuals who have been captured, certain rules for protection of civilians. That's sort of law that is written down. There's a piece of paper that says, Article 1, Article 2, here are the rules, and states sign on to those. But I mentioned also this concept of customary international law. That's usually something, a set of rules that kind of develops over time, followed out of rules that are followed out of sort of a sense of obligation. Sometimes that may have originated in, out of a sense of moral obligation, sometimes even religious obligation, some reference to natural law in some systems. And over time, that sort of hardens into, crystallizes into so-called customary international law. I think one just special feature that I'll just mention here is obviously this is a state, Israel, against a non-state, a non-state actor, a non-state terrorist organization, Hamas. It happens to exercise a lot of governance control, sadly, over Gaza, but it is not itself a party to these rules. I think the consensus view within the international law community is that Hamas itself is still bound by many of these rules, even though it is not itself a state. Israel is bound by these rules, even though it is fighting an enemy that is flouting and perverting those rules. But that's sort of an overview of where these rules come from.
Well, the fact that they claim to be a resistance group, it's not a conventional army or country. Does that mean that Hamas gets a pass legally on this stuff?
No, absolutely not. So especially what I mentioned before, so-called this term of customary international law, that applies to anybody. That applies to resistance movements, non-state actors, guerrilla forces, rebellion forces, whatever one wants to call them, however they're characterized, those rules apply. And so, for example, the deliberate slaughter, the massacre of civilians on October 7th, that's a war crime. The taking of hostages is a specific rule in the law of armed conflict. That applies to any party. That's another war crime. So Hamas is bound by many of these rules. It obviously doesn't follow them, but it is bound as a matter of international.
Okay, so recognizing, accepting that they are bound by the rules, whether or not they follow them. But why is it that so often we only hear about, Israel is going to be brought perhaps before international bodies? And I want to get to the international body in a moment that would be appropriate for that. But why is it that the focus always seems to be on how Israel is fighting the law, fighting when we're following international law? But everyone talks about how terrible what Hamas did was, and so on and so forth. But I don't know that I've heard people use that term so much, whether it's international leaders or public officials or the media. And what I'm saying is Hamas also needs to be held accountable. Is it just we're not hearing it, or am I right that it's not so much out there? And if that's the case, why?
So there are probably different views on this. My view is that a big part of that reflects a certain bias, where Israel is held to a higher standard, held by the media to a higher standard, held by governments to a higher standard, held by UN-sponsored commissions of inquiry or international courts. I think it is held to a higher standard. And I do think it's remarkable how quickly the story in the media shifted from really fast from a story about Hamas atrocities to a story about IDF collateral damage in Gaza. And I think that's unfortunate. It's deeply unjust, but it is a reality. It is a reality that Israel has to operate in. I'll also just say, look, Israel is a democracy, and like any democracy, it's far from perfect. The IDF has a very well-developed system of compliance with the law of armed conflict, but any advanced military force engaged in this type of extended campaign of high-intensity military operations, any military force will commit some infractions of the law of armed conflict. I think that's the reality, but the IDF has a very well-developed compliance system. It's indoctrinated very heavily into these rules. But I do think Israel does tend to be held to a significantly higher standard, even than other advanced militaries.
So let me ask you this, because what is the role of the ICC, the International? What does the CC stand for? International? Is it Criminal Court?
International Criminal Court, a
Right.
court in The Hague. That's right. So this is a standing war crimes court. Its mandate is to investigate and prosecute the very worst war crimes in the world, and it's intended to be sort of a court of last resort. The international law and the mandate of the ICC, which again is based in The Hague, Netherlands. It's written in its mandate that the preference is for state level, national level prosecutions of war crimes, and only really when a state doesn't perform its own accountability is the International Criminal Court supposed to step in. For a number of years now, the ICC has taken on, has been investigating, looking into allegations of war crimes in Israel and the Palestinian territories. This is controversial for a number of reasons, including the fact that Israel is not a state party. Israel hasn't consented. I talked about international law being a system premised very heavily, not necessarily exclusively, but heavily on this idea of consent, and Israel hasn't consented to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. There's also this sort of quirk. I think it's a quirk in the way that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, thinks about its own jurisdiction, which is that it recognizes Palestine as a state. That's another source of controversy about the court's jurisdiction. The last point I'll just say on this is, accountability mechanisms like this, courts, war crimes courts, are yet another way in which there is this very deep asymmetry in the two sides of this war. To put it bluntly, Israel cares a lot about having its officials prosecuted, even investigated by a criminal court like this. Hamas doesn't care at all. And so that creates, again, an asymmetry in the way in which I think in practice law applies to a situation like this.
Well, first of all, by the way, if the ICC recognizes Palestine as a international as an entity, shouldn't it be possible then to hold Hamas operatives
It
responsible for
should.
war
I mean,
crimes?
I would say that, the most blatant, the easiest case to prosecute would be something like the massacre, savage massacre on October 7th. So
Yet no Palestinian or Arab countries seem to be worried, who are
none,
no,
no,
worried about
and
that.
I think again that goes to the significant bias. If I were to guess, the International Criminal Court will not move forward with cases from this conflict or from broader conflicts involving Israel and Hamas or other terrorist groups. I think that's unlikely. I'm not going to say it's impossible. I think there's a real possibility of it, but I think it would cause such it would be an immensely politically difficult set of cases for the ICC to bring. It has its hands full already, having issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. So that's just my guess. A lot depends, though, on the ICC prosecutor. We've had several ICC prosecutors. They come in with their own agendas and views on the different conflicts.
So let me ask you this, Matthew. I'm sure you, like most all of us here, are watching the news coverage considerably, and there we do hear words tossed around, such as Israel's response being disproportional. There we do hear some of the statements that are made. What frustrates you about the media coverage? What have you seen that you think has been just, they're uninformed and they're making stupid comments? And on the other hand, are there any things that you've heard in particular where it seems like they get it right?
Yeah, I think probably one of my biggest grievances is, well, I guess I would have two significant grievances. One is what I referred to earlier as the sort of snap judgments that we saw with regard to the tragic hospital explosion and the burning down of a hospital. There is, I think, a tendency on the part of the media to race against other outlets, and snap judgments are sometimes made. And once they are made, even as new facts come to life, sometimes the original reporting has a certain indelible quality to it. You can't take back some of that coverage, especially you can't take back some of that reporting in societies where the government controls a lot of the information that is getting to its own public. So that's one grievance that I have. Another grievance is, I think, something I also referred to earlier, which is a misapplication of the proportionality principle. Again, a sort of a snap judgment based on body counts. A lot of people have died in these strikes. A lot of people have, or a lot of civilian structures have been destroyed, or what I to be more precise, what appear to, let's say, the naked eye, or is sort of in the moment that you're watching them, appear to be civilian structures, without, again, gathering all the facts. Why was that structure hit? And as I mentioned before, proportionality is not measured in body counts. It's a comparison of the expected civilian collateral damage weighed against the expected military gain. And we're talking here about a terrorist adversary that has, again, embedded itself very deeply in northern Gaza, in highly populated, densely populated areas. And we saw on October 7th and since then that it has the capability to impose, to carry out even extremely destructive military operations. And Israel is now engaged, in my view, in a war of self-defense, where it is necessary to destroy Hamas, and especially Hamas's infrastructure. And in order to do that, in order to be able to achieve that, because of the way that Hamas has embedded itself, literally buried itself in tunnels underneath some of these civilian structures, quite a bit of collateral damage, quite a bit of suffering is the unfortunate, the tragic consequence of this kind of war. That doesn't necessarily amount to a war crime. A war crime requires a lot more than just assessing, like I said, body counts.
Okay, so the question I have then, in just briefly about this, because so often the media, and by the way, to remind everyone, we are going to have a future call just about the media and the coverage. So I'm not asking to analyze the media, but rather just there is such a misuse of that term proportionality. To me, it almost seems as if they're reporting on a NFL football game in terms of just giving us the scores. Are there efforts? Have you been involved to ever try and educate any of the, especially the electronic or the print media. New York Times, I'm sure, is a lost cause. But any efforts on your part, or anyone like you, to help to educate them to understand better how to more correctly use the term of proportionality?
All the
If you're aware
time.
of.
I work on that. I've got many friends and colleagues. There are officials in government, the Israeli government, other governments that are trying to do that. I think it's a very uphill battle. I think it's been hard to sort of penetrate. I think that scorekeeping mentality, that approach that you mentioned earlier. So yes, there are these efforts. They should be continued. They are important, but we need to. I think just the reality, and it's a reality that the Israeli government knows. The reality is there is going to be a limit to how persuasive these efforts can be, and the way in which this conflict is going to be reported on.
So let me ask you, shift gears a little bit, and that is, we've talked about the primary aspect of the military response, and within the context of the international law of armed conflict. What about the whole aspect of the international, the calls and the aid coming in from the Rafah border? Apparently UNRWA, who was probably a subsidiary of Hamas in many respects, but not officially, but UNRWA has said that there's not enough fuel. The IDF tweeted a fantastic response to it. This is, well, if you need more fuel, go check with Hamas. They got plenty. And so, and they said specifically how many millions of gallons they've got. So what about this issue about the permitting of aid to come in and so on? And yet, it's certain respects obviously goes against the military objectives that is and practical objectives Israel's trying to achieve. Any comments about that?
Yeah, I do have some comments on that. I neglected to make another point about proportionality that I do think is important in sort of in fairness, because I do think there are media outlets, advocacy groups, others who do simply misstate the law. But I also mentioned that proportionality is based on judgment. It's based on two sides of a balance, both of which are very hard to calculate, very hard to measure. What's the metric of military necessity? What's the metric of civilian damage beyond just the number of lives lost? Or how much value do you attach to them? These are very difficult legal questions, very difficult moral questions. And so I do think, I'm giving you my view of the correct way in which to assess proportionality. But I also think, there are going to be strikes, campaigns where there's going to be some room for disagreement. That is also just the reality of this body of law. So I mentioned before that where appropriate, I wanted to just provide some counter arguments, and I'll just say there are others that might calculate proportionality differently. I think
keeping in mind is one of the questions that came in, that proportionality depends if you're talking about each individual strike or within the context of the broader
It's a
conflict,
terrific
right?
point. It's a terrific point. Methodologically, the way I would say it is the proportionality rule, the proportionality principle is very easy to state in one sentence, right? The military, this anticipated civilian harm may not be excessive in relation to the anticipated military gain. Easy, there's universal understanding, acceptance that that's the rule. But there are all these different methodological challenges to how you apply it in practice. And that's a brilliant point, that sometimes the unit of analysis can be different. Do you judge proportionality based on the entire air campaign? Do you base it strike by strike, bomb by bomb? And how one scopes that a unit of analysis can also lead to some different judgments. So a very, very easy rule to state in principle, hard to apply. You asked also about what's often been referred to, the Israeli government referred to it as a siege. And I'll just say, in my view, it's a good thing that Israel loosened the terms of that siege in order to allow in some humanitarian assistance, some, my understanding is water, food, but fuel, including electricity, I think is a different story, because the idea of a siege is to seal off the enemy from being able to supply itself, enemy military forces from being able to supply itself, to supply its offensive capabilities, its communication, its internal infrastructure. But you hit on a very difficult challenge here, or a problem with this, which is that Hamas, once there is energy, fuel, electricity, who's going to get it first and who's going to get it last in a place like Gaza? Hamas is going to be fed first, fueled first, and so on. And so I think the law of siege is difficult to apply here. There's also a split of opinion. This is one of these areas of law, international law, where I think there's a split of opinion. There is one view, I think this view is mistaken, that says that any essentially any starvation, any deprivation of a civilian population is illegal and a war crime. I think a better way of thinking about it is that certainly intentional, the deliberate starvation of a civilian population is illegal. You can't use it for collective punishment. You can't deliberately intend to starve the civilian population. You can't use it to terrorize a civilian population. But here again, I come back to this idea of a fundamental balance between military necessity and human suffering, and those two things being balanced in the law of armed conflict. And I think a reasonable judgment could be made that in order to degrade the military effectiveness of Hamas, it is necessary to seal off much of Gaza from receiving certain kinds of resources. Again, I would say not food, not water, not humanitarian assistance, but I would say fuel, electricity is a different story. And there on that, I do think some reasonable people could disagree. I happen to think there's a very reasonable defense of Israel's cutoff of certain kinds of resources like fuel, like electricity.
Matthew, what about the again, you may or may not be able to answer this question, but within the context of hypocrisy within the international community. What I mean by that is there's a guy who just resigned from the State Department because he felt that his moral considerations, and he just wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post, that there were no guarantees that Israel wouldn't be using the weaponry to cause civilian casualties, and that's why he had to resign. Yet he's been doing his job for 10 years, was responsible for sending aid to Ukraine to fight against Russia, and also the United States, certainly, as we all know, when it was conducting its campaign in Afghanistan and elsewhere in Iraq, and even when they tried to kill Osama bin Laden. I remember a number of years ago, they shot and killed an entire family just because the guy was a tall guy. And they thought, oh, that's got to be Osama bin Laden, and wiped out an entire family. And yet the United States and others call for Israel to follow these rules of law. Any comment about the hypocrisy involved in this kind of stuff?
A couple of general comments. One is just to repeat a point from earlier, I do think that Israel tends to be held to a higher standard. Two, we do have to keep in mind a point that I also made earlier, that even that mistakes will happen in the law of armed conflict, and we need to know the facts, but not every error, not every mistake, not every act that has significant civilian harm is a violation of the law. There were some, I worked on post 9/11 counterterrorism policy here in the United States, as you mentioned in the generous introduction. In Afghanistan, U.S. forces unfortunately, very tragically, bombed some wedding parties, mistaking them for groups of militants. U.S. forces, there was one especially tragic incident where it accidentally bombed a Doctors Without Borders facility. So these kinds of things happen. That there is unfortunately, that's the tragic reality of war. The other thing is, or a last point I'll just make is, the United States actually has been a very, I think, restraining force on the IDF. Some would say too restraining. You've heard from the President of the United States and others, senior officials, emphasizing, and I think this is right. Again, I said this is right from a legal standpoint, moral standpoint, strategic standpoint, that Israel must comply with international law. And at least some reports suggest that, for example, it was in part United States pressure that led to some relieving of the initial siege of Gaza. Again, I happen to think that that was appropriate, legally appropriate, morally appropriate, strategically appropriate. But I actually think the United States. Why don't I just leave it there?
Okay. Matthew, the last question I want to ask you, and thank you very much for being so generous with your time, and it's been a fantastic discussion, but now something that's a little bit different than what we've talked about so far. You're a professor on campus of Columbia University, one of the hotbeds of pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel activity. Many of us saw that video that's gone viral of the professor who spoke out about what the environment is like there, and on college campuses in general. Matthew, anything you'd like to share with us to be aware of in terms of what is it like on campus as a I assume you're recognized, or maybe you're not recognized, individual who is helping or taking a position that is certainly sympathetic to Israel, and whether it's for you personally and or just in general. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. And you know what? I did forget to make one last point before, which
Please.
is that with regard to the siege, I did just want to sort of correct the record or add to the record that that's an operation to which the proportionality principle applies, and that's also an area, a point on which I think reasonable people could disagree on whether or not the civilian suffering is disproportionate to the anticipated military gain. To make that assessment, I think we'd need to know more about the military logic on Israel's side, and I just don't think we have all of those facts. But that would be a counter argument, is that it's disproportionate. Let me say a word about what it's like on campus. The short answer is it is a very, very difficult time. It is very divisive. My own starting point, my own priors, which I'll just mention up front, is I'm a big, big believer in campus free speech. I'm sort of a hardliner on that. With very few exceptions. I don't believe that university administrators or faculty should be trying to shut down expression, even if it's very odious expression. In fact, I like to see those odious views exposed and answered. And with, I would say, with freedom of expression comes some responsibility. We as faculty, we as administrators ought to be pushing back and answering speech that we think is misguided, vile, whatever one wants to call it. And in doing so, we need to be careful not to intimidate students, especially more broadly than intended. And that can be a difficult balance to strike. To put that sort of more specifically, since the October 7th, massacre, I think a pogrom is a way to think about it. There have been some views expressed loudly and publicly on university campuses that in some cases excuse Hamas's atrocities, basically saying, Israel had it coming. Or even in some extreme cases, outright celebrating or glorifying those attacks. I don't know what the right way, given my strong commitment to free speech, I don't know quite what the right answer is with regard to that extreme speech. But with regard to much more common expressions that I think could be characterized as seeking to justify or excuse Hamas's massacre. First, I do find it quite morally perverse that some campus organizations supposedly dedicated to the rights of vulnerable people, vulnerable groups, would not even acknowledge, let alone condemn, what is unambiguously a pogrom. What do they think Hamas is? Who do they think Hamas would come after next if it had the chance? I think the hypocrisy is egregious in another way too, which is that I think if there had been a massacre of any other religious or ethnic or minority group like the one that Hamas perpetrated, and 48 hours later, campus speakers blamed the victims, I think the administrative repercussions would have been swift and punishing. And I do think that's a double standard that we're seeing here. There needs to be a reckoning in universities across the country on this. I will just mention, especially with a group like this, one very, very small silver lining, but it is silver, which is I've been here for 15 years and I've never seen an event bring together the Jewish community, the Israeli community here on campus, like I've seen for the last 2 weeks. Unfortunately, many in that community feel isolated, they feel abandoned, they see doors shut on them. But there is internally within that community a real sense of togetherness and mutual support.
Matthew, thank you very much. Matthew Waxman, a professor of international law at NYU, for participating and really giving us an outstanding briefing. Again, this will be recorded, it'll be available on the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition website, which is zionisrabbis.org, where you can also find other webinars that we have offered, including ones that are going to be coming up. The next one next Tuesday morning in regard to the halakhic and moral perspective. And Matthew also touched upon the practical perspective of what's going on and the way in which it's reported in the media. Those are all subjects of some of the future webinars we'll be holding as well, in addition to trying to galvanize support through our letter of solidarity and unity of rabbis with Israel, which now has close to 800 signatures so far. If you haven't signed it yet and you're a rabbi or you know a rabbi, please be sure to pass it along as well. And let us pray for the safe release and speedy return of all those who are being held captive, and also for the refuah shlema of full and speedy recovery for those who have been injured. And also we pray for success and strength for Israel, Tzahal, IDF, as it prepares to respond to the heinous attack of October 7. Thank you very much, Matthew, and thanks to everyone for joining us. It's been a wonderful call and very, very enlightening and very helpful. Have a good day.
Thanks for inviting me. And again, thanks to all of you for all the work that I know you're doing in this very difficult time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.